Treasurer, the state treasurers argue that you need to bring forward infrastructure spending in order to stimulate the economy. You've said that they should bring forward some of the infrastructure projects that they've got in the pipeline. How is this blame game at the expense of our economy acceptable?
Well, the truth is we are working cooperatively with the state governments in delivering some of the most significant infrastructure projects Australia has ever seen. At the federal level, we're contributing $100 billion over a 10-year period, and that is creating tens of thousands of jobs across the country, 7,000 jobs for the Bruce Highway, 10,000 jobs with WestConnex, 16,000 jobs for Melbourne-Brisbane Inland Rail, and once the second airport in Sydney is up and running, that will support some 28,000 jobs. So these are major projects that we're undertaking. We're hitting some capacity constraints, Sharri, in the big markets of Melbourne and Sydney, but we are working cooperatively with the states and will continue to do so.
Is there going to be spending brought forward, though? Are you expecting some of these infrastructure projects to start getting underway?
Well, the Prime Minister has written to the state premiers and chief ministers about the possibility of bringing forward potential projects that would be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and we're encouraging the state and territory leaders to respond to that letter. What's important is to ensure that if you do bring forward a particular project, that its construction is also brought forward, not just the expenditure, and again that needs to take into account the individual circumstances in that particular state, the access to materials, for example boring machines or bitumen, cement, diesel. There's a whole range of inputs, as well as obviously skilled contractors, that are critical to delivering on these big infrastructure projects.
Treasurer, some leading economists have criticised the RBA's current approach to monetary policy, the repeated rate cuts, saying that it's actually driving down consumer confidence, which is at its lowest level in 4 years. Do you think this is an issue?
Well, obviously, monetary policy matters for the independent board of the Reserve Bank, and the government is responsible for fiscal policy. Of the 75 basis points in rate cuts that have been undertaken by the RBA in recent months, about 57 basis points of that have been passed on by the major banks. Now, that's good news for borrowers. If you're someone with a $400,000 mortgage, that means you'll probably be saving more than $1,500 a year on your interest payments. At the same time, if you're depositing money in the bank, you're going to be hit by those lower interest rates. But decisions about monetary policy are those for the independent board of the Reserve Bank, and I do note that interest rates globally have come down significantly, not just in Australia.
It is obviously the responsibility of the Reserve Bank, but given they haven't had the desired effect and the RBA hasn't met its inflation band of 2 to 3% in quite a while, do you think you now need to embrace a more aggressive set of fiscal policy settings in order to stimulate the economy?
Well, you're right, Sharri. The inflation band, which is 2 to 3%, hasn't been met for some time. Indeed, probably in 17 of the last 20 quarters, we haven't met that target, and right now inflation is at 1.6%. When it comes to fiscal policy, obviously the significance of the tax cuts shouldn't be underestimated. We know that more than $18 billion has made its way out of the doors of the ATO into the pockets of hard-working Australians. That's money that will be spent at corner stores. That money will be spent with local tradies and businesses, and that's money that people will use to pay down their own mortgages and their own loans. That's a matter for them. But we have got record infrastructure spending, we're creating apprenticeships, and of course we've got these tax cuts, all of which together with the interest rate cuts will contribute to increase economic activity.
You just mentioned a moment ago that central banks the world over are either cutting or looking at cutting interest rates. How worried are you about the significant softening of our economy? And I mean, you're the Treasurer, you have more information than anyone. You know, how real is the prospect that there could be a recession?
Well, there's no doubt that the Australian economy is facing headwinds both domestically and globally, and we haven't played down the significance of those headwinds, but we've also been very clear that the Australian economy is better placed than any other economy around the world to actually meet those challenges. We have a AAA credit rating, we have a strong labour market. We've been helping to create more than 1.4 million new jobs since we came to government, and we have an unemployment rate today at 5.3%, whereas when we came to government it was 5.7%. And that being said, the punishing drought is not only hurting the economy but hurting families and farmers and people in regional communities. And the global trade tensions, Sharri, between the US and China are real, and that is denting global economic confidence. That's weighing negatively on the global economic outlook, and that's leading to the deferral of investment decisions and a slowdown in capital flows. So all of that does paint a mixed picture for the economy.
You just mentioned a moment ago that the tax cuts will start to flow through. Do you think that is going to have an impact, or is it negligible? You know, we haven't seen it yet, and they've been coming through for a couple of months now.
Well, what we haven't received yet is the September quarter national account numbers. We received the June quarter, but that didn't have either the full impact of the rate cuts or of the tax cuts, both of which are now playing their way through. So there's no doubt some people are saving or paying down, as I say, mortgages and other loans. Others are spending that money. You know, it will depend household by household, but there's no doubt those tax cuts have put money into people's pockets, and that will contribute to the overall economic activity.
I spoke to you about a couple of weeks ago, about the issue in the wake of the Royal Commission, where banks and other financial institutions were really tightening up their lending criteria when it comes to not just home loans but renovations or lending money for someone who wants to start or grow their business. And there was the one case even of a couple who were told that they couldn't have repeated IVF treatments if they wanted to borrow a loan. Just generally speaking, do you think the fact that our banks are becoming a lot more strict when it comes to lending money to Australians, is this also having an impact on our economy, do you think?
There's no doubt a risk aversion on the part of the banks and their lending officers does have an impact on the flow of credit. Now, in part, they're responding to the Royal Commission, and in part they're responding, you know, to tighter regulatory controls with the responsible lending obligations. And as I've said publicly, it's important to get that balance right. Of course, responsible lending is about consumer protection, but at the same time, you've got to encourage people to take personal responsibility for their own circumstances, and you can't tie down banks in red tape, and you've got to ensure the free flow of credit. So we can't allow that pendulum to swing too far either way. We've got to keep it finely balanced, and I know the regulators are conscious of that, and I know the banks are. So I'm confident that we will see a greater flow of credit into the future, bearing in mind that we have seen an increase in home loan approvals, both for investors as well as owner-occupiers, and that's not a bad outcome either. That's not a bad outcome either for the economy.
Now, Treasurer, just to a topic that's a little bit close to home for you, both personally and also in your electorate, and it's something we spoke about on my show last week, and that's the really heartbreaking case of a 5-year-old boy and a 12-year-old boy who both were subject to really horrific anti-Semitic bullying at Melbourne public schools. I understand, I know you haven't wanted to speak about it, but I understand, I've learnt that you actually intervened behind the scenes to try and help these families. Can you update us on the situation and what's happening?
Well, one of those schools was actually in my electorate, and obviously I'll be having, you know, discussions with the school to get their perspective. But I have met with the families of the two boys, and I met with them in the presence of Dan Tehan, the Federal Education Minister. I know that the families also met with James Merlino, the State Education Minister, and in both cases they got a very good hearing, and their stories are pretty harrowing, to be honest. You know, that level of intimidation and abuse, in some cases physical abuse, not just verbal, is unacceptable, and it takes, you know, a great emotional toll on our kids. And our kids, regardless of their race or their religion or their colour or their sex, should not be subject to that abuse in the school or in the workplace or indeed anywhere. Now, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, Sharri, across the country, and it's been documented about a 60% increase over recent years. And I know from first-hand experience in the election campaign, I had my signage daubed with SWAT stickers, and I know some of my colleagues who are not from a Jewish background also had SWAT stickers daubed on their signage. So it is unacceptable that we've seen this rise in anti-Semitism and the use of the SWAT sticker, which is repugnant to every free-thinking person in our country, and we must never forget that Australians fought and died in the battle against fascism and tyranny and Nazism. And in this country, we cherish our freedom, we cherish freedom of religion, and people should not be intimidated in the way these two kids have been.
Do you think it's got to the point where some parents of Jewish children feel that it's not safe to send their children to a public school? You know, are we at the point where Jewish kids are only feeling safe to go to a Jewish school?
No, I don't think we're at that point, and nor should we ever be at that point. My parents went to non-Jewish schools, and indeed many of my friends went to non-Jewish schools, and that should be encouraged and supported, and it's really a matter of choice for the parents and for the students in question. But what we cannot tolerate in our civilised society is the type of behaviour that was exhibited towards these two boys, one only 5 years of age, as well as the one who was a bit older at 12. And you know, the abuse that they received is abhorrent to everyone. And I do want to point out that I have been contacted by Muslim members of the community, friends of mine, who have been equally, disgusted and impacted by the image of that boy being forced to kneel and kiss the feet of a young Muslim boy. That is horrific for anybody, and it's not about Muslim intimidation here. There are many members of the community, regardless of their religion, who would see those actions and that abuse as completely unacceptable.
The Australian Jewish News reported today that there was another 15 incidents that they've found out about of anti-Semitic bullying in schools since they first published the story a week ago, and they were the outlet, of course, that broke this story, which has since gone worldwide. But what do you make of the Victorian Education Department's approach when they refused to treat it as anti-Semitism at all? They were effectively turning a blind eye.
Well, I think the schools need to take it upon themselves, and the education system more broadly, to tackle this problem. And that means increasing the quality and the level of education about the Holocaust and about intolerance and racism, so that we don't see a repeat of that type of activity in the future.